coming. We are just at 6 o'clock on the dot, but we're going to give everyone a few more minutes to stroll in for some stragglers. So for those of you that are here, you probably noticed a bunch of coffee, Timbits, etc. at the table there on the right. So please go help yourself, and we will get started here very shortly. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. So we're a little bit after 6, trying to stay on schedule here. We will get started. So before we get started, we just want to start with a general land acknowledgement. So we do acknowledge and honor the 4 nations whose land we gather today, the Siniat, the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, and the Sioux. This acknowledgement is by no means any real meaningful contribution towards reconciliation, but we do think it's an important starting point to at least get conversations going and at least acknowledging where we all are very privileged to live, work, and play today. So, everyone's here for short-term rentals, right? Awesome. Perfect. Thank you for coming. Thank you for those that are attending online. My name is Paul. I'm the director of the Development Services Group, and with us today we have Erica, Ruth, Adrian, Kenny, all members of the Development Services Group at the front counter. You have Jen and Shannon, who hopefully were able to very efficiently sign you in. Thank you very much. It really helps us track engagement for these types of events. Behind the scenes, we have Jay from our IT group doing a phenomenal job at pulling this all off in a very professional way. And we're also very lucky to have with us today Mr. Evan Parliament, who is our Chief Administrative Officer. And next to him there is our Director of Engineering and Public Works, Mr. Steve Black. So you got a bunch of us from the city today to hopefully answer some questions that you guys have. So before we delve into our overview of our brief presentation, a couple housekeeping items. As indicated, a bunch of coffee and snacks at the side. Please go help yourself now. Get up throughout the presentations. We want it all gone so that it doesn't come back with us to development services. You don't want us spending taxpayer money on snacks for ourselves, so please go and get it. Exits, both ends of the room, bathrooms, behind us here, as well as out the door, all the way at the end of the hallway to your left. And I think we are good for housekeeping items there. Did I miss anything, Kenny? Awesome. So we're going to give a brief presentation. You're not going to have to hear me talk very long, which is a very good thing because those of you that know me know that I really like to talk. But you're going to hear from our other team members today for this presentation. So we're going to start off. We've already done the introduction, thankfully. Rules of engagement, very important to go over rules of engagement at the beginning of this. We're going to give you guys a general overview of what the current rules for short-term rental are. We're going to go over some short-term rental statistics. Really important to have that good background data before we start delving into should we or how do we change short-term rental regulations. We're going to give you an overview of what this project entails and what we're trying to achieve with it. And then most importantly, we're going to conclude with a Q&A. Keep in mind, we're at the very beginning of this project. The main intent tonight is to start to spread awareness of this project, answer questions that you guys have, give you an overview of how this project is going to unfold so that the community can participate as part of this project. So, rules of engagement, and then you're done with me. Be respectful of everyone. Everyone has different opinions. It's very important that we're respectful of everyone, each other, as well as staff. Staff work very hard to put on these events and to represent the public interest in everything we do for the city. Be mindful of time. We want to make sure that everyone can participate. Remember, focus on the future, not the past. Sometimes it's human nature. We do have a tendency when we come to these events to talk about things that happened in the past that we may not be super happy with, but things that are the way they are. So let's really focus on the future and how we can work towards building a really positive community for Revelstoke. Stay on task. We're here to talk short-term rental. There's a lot of other pressing issues in the community and a lot of good work that's being done on some of those items, but today the focus is short-term rental. Be open-minded to others. You know, everyone has different perspectives. Be open to learn and participate through this process. And one really important thing, remember that this is a very complex topic. And even as we kind of guide you, Erica is going to come up here in a minute to go over our current regulatory framework for short-term rentals. It is complex. There is history to it. Regulating this type of development is complex and it's not simple, and no municipality has found the one silver bullet to do this. So let's keep that in mind as we delve into this really interesting topic. And with that, I will pass it over to Erica.
So what are the current short-term rental regulations? This is important to get a good basis and the foundation for understanding our current regulations as we move through this process of the project. So short-term rentals, also known as STRs, and then we also have regulations over bed and breakfast, which we call B&Bs. So within the city, both STRs and B&Bs are regulated in our zoning bylaw. So STR, this refers to as a use of a self-contained dwelling unit that is operated for less than 30 days. So it's a temporary use for less than 30 consecutive days. Whereas a B&B involves letting out rooms within your primary dwelling on a temporary basis. And this is so renting rooms in your house where you live and reside, and then you have common areas within your house that are for your guests as well. So a B&B, it's permitted in all standard residential zones. However, it is only permitted to be operated in a single family dwelling. Where STR, it's permitted in different zones within the bylaw. So we'll get into some of those specific zones. And there's different requirements over STR. So it may be permitted within a full home rental, multi-unit building, or where there's a permanent resident on-site operator requirement. So first off, where a whole home STR is allowed within single detached dwellings within the city. So you have two maps here just showing the spot zone property examples, and those are throughout the city where property owners were applied for rezoning applications to allow for full home rentals, and this is commonly known as the R1V and R2V zones. So within these zones, you can have a full home rental. However, you do have to have 24/7 or 24/7 property management service, and this is a service in town. So in April 2022 is when staff came out to the community and council adopted updated short-term rental regulations. So adding into the full home rentals, we allowed this use in two different zones. So this is the C1 downtown zone and the C6 Victoria Road commercial, which you can see on the bottom map there. So this added around 21 single family dwellings that could be eligible to be operated. So it doesn't mean that they are being operated, but it allowed more eligibility in these specific areas. So for full home rentals in multi-unit dwellings, this isn't permitted in any standard residential zone. It would be a specific rezoning application that went to the city for what we call a comprehensive development zone, so a CD zone. So these multi-unit dwellings zones there's 6 throughout the city, and you see in the map there, there's the resort, Mackenzie Village, adjacent to the highway in the Farwell area, and then there's some along Townley Street and Powerhouse Industrial area. Many of the buildings and uses in these zones are not built out. They're pretty large properties. And so staff estimate with the permitted uses within the zone, you could see around 1,000 to 3,500 units if there was full build out. So currently there's 457 in the, that are built out in these zones. So another regulation that we have added to the bylaw in 2022 is the use of a short-term rental where you have permanent resident on-site operator. So this is a permitted use within 2 new zones. So this is the C2 downtown fringe zone. So that's in the top image there where it's between the C1 downtown zone and then residential properties. And then there's 59 properties adjacent to Hay Road, which is between the resort and Mackenzie Village. The restriction with this zone is a permanent resident on-site operator must operate the STR, and they must live in the house of either the main principal use or the main principal dwelling or the secondary suite, and then they would operate the other unit out. There is also the requirement that the permanent resident on-site operator must have this as their declared permanent address. So with these 2 new additions to the current zoning bylaw, it allowed up to 101 additional STRs within these areas. So it's just a quick summary of the current regulations. We're here to answer any more questions because when you do go through the zoning bylaw, there's a lot to go through there, and so we're here to answer any questions. But I'm just going to pass the mic over to Ruth, who will go through the statistics of our current framework.
So, what are the stats? What is currently built out that is allowable to be used as a short-term rental? There are 66 single detached dwellings that can be rented out as a whole home short-term rental. 457 multi-unit dwellings can be used as a whole home short-term rental. And there are 101 single detached dwellings that can be used as a short-term rental when operated by a permanent resident on-site operator. In total, this equates to 15%, 624 of all dwellings in the city that could be used as legal STRs. When the resort and Mackenzie Village are removed, this would go down to 5%, with half having principal residence requirements. Some more stats around business licensing. If all built-out short-term rentals were in operation, it would equate to approximately 33% of all tourist accommodation in town. We've issued 239 business licenses for short-term rentals and bed and breakfasts. In 2023, we received 134 complaints, and in 2024, this went down to 71. These complaints can range anything from noise complaints to parking and go all the way up to illegal operators or people illegally operating in areas they're not zoned for. Our enforcement is both proactive and reactive, and we have 219 enforcement files related to short-term rental. So why are we reviewing short-term rental now? The most recent update to short-term rental regulations was in 2022. In October 2023, the province passed Bill 35, giving more tools to local government to regulate short-term rental. Staff presented an overview of new provincial legislation to the community in February 2024, and in October 2024, Council directed staff to revisit the short-term rental regulations as part of the 2025 work plan. I'm going to hand over to Adrienne, and she'll be able to talk a little bit more about the short-term rental project in depth.
So thank you everyone for being here today because we're at the very beginning of our project. So seeing as many people that are interested is really great because that's what we need. We need your feedback. The objectives of this project: to improve community understanding of the existing short-term rental regulatory framework and the provincial legislation, Bill 35. Provide an objective information to council and the community on the implications associated with different ways of regulating short-term rental. Establish a clear objective of what the community is seeking to achieve by updating STR regulations. And create more clear and comprehensive short-term rental regulatory framework in Revelstoke. It helps us help you, and you help us. Our deliverables. Today is one. So community engagement, including 2 to 4 public information sessions and 1 to 2 community surveys. We also need to do an economic analysis on the implications of different short-term rental regulation scenarios. And we need to make amendments to our zoning bylaw, our business license bylaw, our municipal ticketing information bylaw, our fees and charges bylaw, and our DS policy, which is our short-term rental regulation policy, to implement these new regulations. We're going to be doing this as a 4-phase project. So we're currently in the first phase, which is project management, a background review, and an initial engagement. And we're hoping to have this wrapped up by March 2025. Phase 2, which will go into the summer of 2025 in July, will be more of our scenario development and understanding more of the economic analysis here in Revelstoke. Phase 3 will go back out to a little bit more of the community engagement focus, refining what those scenarios are, and drafting the bylaw, which we hope to have done by October 2025. Phase 4, that's the hope for the public launch and the initial for council's consideration, which we hope to have at the end of 2025 in December, but that might end up bleeding into 2026. Our public engagement. We're going to be in the involve category. That's why you're here tonight. We're keeping you as part of it. We want you as part of it, and we really do need your feedback on this. Public information sessions and community surveys will be going out. We'll be holding targeted stakeholder engagement with different community groups, including Tourism Revelstoke, our community business community, council committees, and others. Other resources for you to stay engaged and keep on top of what this is going to look like over the next year are signing up for our community newsletter, visiting Talk Revelstoke, and checking out our social media accounts. One of the most important things about communicating out today is that we just launched our first public survey, and that's on Talk Revelstoke. So if you can even take a moment tonight before you go home while you're here, it's a 9-question survey. We're just trying to catch the temperature of where our community is currently at so we can capture a moment in time to help us with the direction that the community wants to go. So, questions? You can use the Slido app. You can use the code on the back of the walls over there, and you can use your phone, and you can get into the Slido app. You can also go to slido.com and enter in the code that is right there. Another way to do it if you want to have questions is you just walk up to the mic. We're really happy to hear from you, and we'll be taking questions that way. And for all of our viewers that are at home, if you scroll down into the description of the YouTube, you'll be able to find the Slido app description, and you'll be able to log on directly from there. Thank you, everyone.
So with that, do we have any brave souls, since you guys have attended here in person, that are keen to come up to the microphone first? And it looks like we have one.
I'll break the ice. So I think you presented one of the slides with a timeline of what had been done in the past in 2022, 2023, 2024. If I remember correctly, about a year ago, we gathered here and you presented the province's legislation about short-term rentals. And if I remember correctly, you had agreed as a council or as a city to work on analyzing the economics and presenting us back in October a proposal or findings about what we're going to do with short-term rentals. So a year later, I feel we're like back to square one. So just wanted to know what happened between then and now.
Thank you for coming up, and important background to dissect a little bit. So in February 2024, so 1 year ago, we gave a presentation about our current regulatory framework and the new provincial legislation and how we were going to be moving forward. And what was outlined there was basically we had deferred looking at things like opting into a principal residence requirement that was available under the new provincial legislation because we didn't have enough information yet. So we also don't have this as a budgeted project in 2024. And these projects take time, they take money. There's other priorities in the department. We were doing our zoning bylaw comprehensive rewrite at the same time. So when we spoke with council about it, it was okay, we don't have capacity. It's an unbudgeted project. Let's reconvene in October 2024, and council can give us direction at that time to say, development services, incorporate this into your 2025 work plan, and that's where we're at now. So the project was basically deferred for a decision on whether or not it was going to proceed until October 2024. At that time, council said, yep, DS, put it into your 2025 work plan. And 2025 came around real fast, and now it's in our work plan, and we are going full steam ahead to get this project over the finish line this year. Does that make sense? Perfect.
It's going to be too tall for me though, make me look really short. Down? Okay, there we go. I'm probably going to blab on for a little bit as well, so I'm sorry if I do take up a bit of time. But good evening, my name is Emily Revel and I'm the owner and operator of Stay Revy Vacation Rentals. Today I'm speaking on behalf of not only myself and our property owners, but also the many businesses and workers who rely on short-term rental industry in Revelstoke. From cleaners and property managers to tradespeople, local suppliers and small businesses, our industry plays a vital role in supporting our community's economy. We're here today to discuss an important issue facing Revelstoke, the potential impacts of opting into Bill 35. Our city has already implemented a structured and well-balanced approach to short-term rentals, only permitting short-term rentals in a few areas in our city. We must ask ourselves if we want to disrupt a system that is already working. I want to bring up just a few key points and consequences of this legislation, followed by a question. In early 2022, Revelstoke dedicated significant resources to establish clear zoning regulations for short-term rentals, providing structure for both operators and the community. Zoning Bylaw 2295 ensures compliance, protects neighborhood integrity, and allows for high-quality accommodations that attract tourism, an essential part of our economy. The city is currently spending $70,000 on a third-party study to assess whether opting into the provincial regulations is necessary. Given that our current regulations are functioning well, do we really believe that Bill 35 is going to improve this or undermine the stability that we've already created? Many individuals have purchased properties in Revelstoke under the assumption that the existing zoning regulations would remain stable. If these rules suddenly change, homeowners who invested in good faith will see property values drop and their ability to resell at fair market value will be compromised. This kind of regulatory instability can make Revelstoke a less attractive place to invest in real estate, even as locals. Homeowners cannot be expected to trust zoning laws if they can be altered at any time, drastically impacting their financial security. Short-term rentals support an entire network of local workers and businesses in Revelstoke. Cleaners, property managers, maintenance staff, handymen, tradespeople, hot tub service providers, real estate agents, accountants, laundromats, local construction companies, retail shops, and restaurants all benefit from the presence of short-term rentals. A sudden reduction in short-term rentals would mean lost jobs and a weaker local economy. Our community cannot afford to see widespread job losses in these industries simply because of a legislative change. Opting into Bill 35 could have some serious consequences for the housing market. It would allow all secondary suites in primary residences to become short-term rentals, which might reduce affordable long-term rental availability, pushing up prices and making it harder for workers and families to find housing. Not to mention bringing short-term rentals back into our residential neighborhoods, which is precisely what the 2022 zoning bylaw changes set out to avoid. Additionally, properties that were built specifically for tourism accommodations could shift to long-term housing that isn't affordable. further limiting options for locals. Bill 35 may not truly solve our housing challenges and could potentially make things worse. Revelstoke has already taken the initiative to regulate short-term rentals responsibly. Our city's approach has allowed for sustainable tourism, economic growth, and work towards a more balanced housing market. Bill 35 threatens to disrupt this balance, with consequences that could negatively impact homeowners, local businesses, and renters. So my question is, do we want to hand over control of our housing market to provincial legislation that will not serve our community's best interests, or do we want to stand by our existing framework, one that has already carefully tailored to Revelstoke's unique needs?
Thank you for that. That was quite the analysis there. You're doing our job for us. To answer that question, this is very the preliminary start of looking at what the community is, their understanding of the current legislation and the current city regulations, if it is working. Those options are in the first survey. As we go through this process, we're starting pretty high level of asking the questions to narrow down where we're going with this. So that permanent resident option in Bill 35, because Bill 35 had other regulations that all cities have embedded into their systems, except for the permanent resident requirement, which was not required for resort municipalities, and you can opt in. So I think that's what you're talking about. So right now, that's not the main focus of the discussion, even though that is a consideration down the road. But it's getting a good understanding of what the community wants with these regulations, how they see them in the community, whether you want locals to participate in the tourist economy. By all means, only regulate short-term rental to allow long-term rental, where there's appropriate locations. It's opening it back up for that discussion to see if maybe we are doing it right with the current regulations, or maybe there's something that we can fix with our regulations without opting in or opting in. It's really finding out how the community currently feels now that you've tested the regulations that we put in place in 2022.
Am I being right to say that you can't stack the regulations? So you can't, with the current regulations, you can't just bring in like a few of them and stack them on top?
So the question was, if anyone can hear it, can you stack regulations? And do you mean on top of the provincial regulations?
Current regulations we have, if we bring in the provincial legislation, can we stack that on top of our current regulations, or that kind of pushes away what we've currently got as our zoning bylaw and brings in just the new Bill 35 resolutions?
Well, if you brought in the Bill 35 permanent resident on-site operator, you could stack city zoning regulations that are stricter, but then that would be the base requirement. So we've drafted regulations that what we think work for the community. So that's why we're not specifically saying, let's go that way without knowing the whole impact. Like you said, the economic analysis, that's part of this review, and understanding how it works for someone that's not maybe directly impacted with short-term rentals. Maybe they are an operator where they're cleaning, a hot tub business. There's a lot to look at. That's where we want to take the whole year to have a good understanding of what's in the best interest of the public interest of the community, and not just select few interest groups.
Okay, for those that are here in person, not to pick on you guys for being brave and coming out here in person, but we don't have any questions on the Slido app, which is, I will be totally honest, a very big surprise.
Really?
I sent one. It keeps saying that they need their under review.
Hi, I think I know the answer to this, but can you just clarify with the zoning bylaw rewrite, if there's any changes or modifications to SDRs and B&Bs, and if there's any nuances there with rezoning, like, you understand the question?
I might get my colleagues to jump in on this for me, but with the new zoning rewrite, there'll no longer be the V, which you have for vacation rentals like R1V. It's going to be rolled into different forms, which might look like RLD6 or other zoning designations in the draft zoning bylaw. But for the most part, it's still going to be the short-term rental policy that is aligning with what the regulations are for permanent on-site operator, that kind of thing. Well, there is one draft zone. It's in the Thomas Brooks area, which is, we're in the process of working on accompanying to the resort at the moment, like the RTA1, if anyone knows what the RTA1 is, it's the Thomas Brooks area. It's a very specific zoning for that neighborhood. If they are going to be choosing to subdivide to a smaller lot size, they would no longer be permitted to be a vacation rental. Yeah. Am I answering that correctly? Or Paul, do you want to jump in there?
Just to sum it up in a high-level way, no one who has short-term rental zoning right now is having it taken away as part of the zoning bylaw comprehensive rewrite. We were very careful with that. Short-term rental is its own topic that warrants its own project, so we didn't wrap it up as part of the zoning bylaw comprehensive rewrite. What you will see, though, is if you have one of those spot zone properties that Erica was referring to, those V ones, we've lumped y'all into the same zone called RLD6 now, and the only change we made was you can't subdivide. And the reason for that is because we don't want to see more proliferation of short-term rental while we're in the midst of this project. So the outcome of this project might result in that changing, but for the time being, while we're going through this process, we don't want to see a big property that's zoned for short-term rental with one of those, again, those RV properties subdivided into multiple RV properties. And lucky you guys, keep coming up to the mic because you guys came in here, so you get priority, but the questions are coming through here. So we have 15 of them.
Okie dokie. So there's commercial property taxes and residential property taxes. So is there any implication on your property taxes if you're a full-term, short-term rental in your residential home? And are you paying on a commercial rate? And that's the question.
That is a great question. So at this point, and I'll let my colleagues correct me if I'm wrong here, but the rate at which you're taxed is determined through BC assessment. So whether it's commercial or residential taxation, that is determined through your BC assessment systems. So whether you're operating it as a residential building or whether it's operated as commercial, the zoning isn't necessarily the determining factor as far as BC assessments.
But they are taxed at residential. And this council, along with prior councils, has advocated for you through UBCM, Union of BC Municipalities, for BC assessment to create a separate tax classification to capture this short-term rental type use, which has not yet been created. So they are taxed residentially predominantly right now. Okay, so why don't we go to a first question on the Slido site here, because we have 18 of them. Give you guys a bit of a break. First question, will targeted stakeholder engagement include specific neighborhoods? For example, Thomas Brook has unique OCP, official community plan policies around short-term rental. So as of right now, and someone might be referencing this because when we just did the zoning bylaw rewrite that's currently before council, we went on kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood basis to do engagement. We aren't proposing to do that as part of the short-term rental project. We will be doing some targeted stakeholder engagement in conjunction with the broader community engagement because we have some key stakeholder groups in this community that would be acutely impacted and also have data that we're going to need for this project. So Revelstoke Accommodation Association, Tourism Revelstoke, for example, the Chamber of Commerce, very critical to engage with those stakeholders in the community to understand their point of view as we go through this process to make sure that it is a balanced process.
All right, reading next on the Slido app. With new legislation for 4 dwelling units per property, Would an already zoned property for STR be able to operate multiple units as STRs? The short answer is no. So you're permitted one STR, and there's also a maximum allowable bedroom count as well for 4 bedrooms. So it'd still be the same regulations. So even if you had one single-family dwelling, you built a second single-family dwelling, you'd only be allowed one.
The next question on the Slido app is, can the permanent residence clause be applied to select zones rather than blanketed across the entire community? So currently, that's how it is with the city's regulations. Certain zones require that permanent resident, or they require a private property, like ownership or company to come in and operate on site for them. So that's something that the city is currently doing. And I'm not quite sure if this is in relation or paired with Bill 35, but that's currently what the city is doing. It's kind of spot zoned in that way. Certain zones require that to have that permanent resident on-site operator.
And just to clarify, if it is in relation to Bill 35, if we opted into the principal residency requirement, and just to be really clear before I elaborate on that, this project is not intended to be a referendum on do we opt in or do we not opt into that principal residence requirement that we discussed at length last February. If you're not too sure what we're referring to, definitely tune into that YouTube video. It gives a lot of good info on it. But it's not intended to be a referendum on that. It's supposed to be, what are we trying to achieve with short-term rental regulations? And let's look at all the tools in the toolbox on how we ultimately get there. But if we did opt into the principal residency requirement, we could build in more strict regulations that would sit on top of that would restrict short-term rental in different areas, regardless of whether or not it was operated by a principal resident.
Okay, so before jumping on to the next question on slide, I just want to confirm if anybody in the room does want to come up to the mic. Have at her.
Yeah. First of all, I think STRs are high-quality tourist experiences that have value, and I'm not opposed to them at all. I think that this balance of needing housing versus turning long-term rental potential into STRs is an important one, and I think that because there's economic impacts of opting in, opting out, where we allow STRs, I think that just the guiding principle of creating a development environment where housing development is the most financially viable that it can be in this town, so people can build housing. If that means, hosting an STR in a suite, okay. It's just something to consider. I think because the cost of building new housing has become very prohibitive to make it financially viable for most people. Do we have enough STRs to meet demand if they all get built out? Or are we in a situation where we don't have enough? And so that is sort of something I feel like a question that has to be answered to guide what the city does. One other question was, and if we somehow opened it up to a circumstance where everyone could STR, would the market balance itself between long-term rentals and short-term rentals? Not everyone is going to want to stay in someone's less ideal, if there's a lot to choose from. If everyone has an STR in their suite and there's a lot to choose from, not everyone's going to be able to operate as an STR. Another thought. And then one other thing, I want to be able to STR my house while I'm out of town for a few months. So I don't have to leave my house sitting empty, which might be a problem that everyone encounters if you can't legally disappear for a few months and make your house be utilized for housing. So those are just a few thoughts I had and a couple questions.
Thank you. Yeah, you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. That is kind of the whole intention of this project, is to hear from the community, from both the locals, from the tourism industry, everything. Are the current regulations working? Are they not working? Is there a gap in the accommodation industry? Does that gap need to be filled by tourist accommodations or short-term rentals. So yeah, thank you for saying that. That is, we need to hear the comments on both sides. We want to make sure that everybody gets to have their say. Again, that's the whole point of this project, so thank you.
So you may have noticed we're kind of going down the line answering questions, but I think everyone would agree, Kenny didn't actually have to answer a question there. He just responded to a comment. So I think that, especially since Kenny really oversees our bylaw group, I think he should have to answer the next one on the Slido site. I think that's only fair.
I mean, I figured that one was coming anyways. I figured I'd get past that one back. So the Slido question is, complaints were basically cut in half between 2023 and 2024. Why the drop? And honestly, that's a great question. It's a hard one to answer because the regulatory framework didn't really change between that part, but our enforcement did increase. So the proactive enforcement did increase between 2023 and 2024. So we did have our bylaw officers out there doing those proactive enforcement out. We were utilizing a software that we had at the time called Host Compliance, which did allow us to identify and locate these short-term rentals, which allowed easier, no, I shouldn't say easier, more readily available information to actually start the enforcement process, whereas historically it was a little more challenging. So that was kind of that shift between 2023 and 2024, and coming into 2025 now as well, we have dedicated additional resources towards short-term rentals, working on and enforcing and gaining compliance on our current regulatory regime. So ideally, we'd love to see the complaints drop even more, and that results back to a lot of it does tie back to the fact that we are doing more proactive enforcement on specifically short-term rentals, along with many other topics. But
Thank you, Kenny. That was adequate. So next question. What have other resort communities done regarding Bill 35? Provide a few examples. Makes me really happy that we actually have done some background research on this, so we are prepared for this question. So we've looked at all 14 resort municipalities, obviously including ourselves in there, and only 2 of them have actually opted into the principal residency requirement, being Tofino and Osoyoos. So both those municipalities are in a bit of a state of flux when it comes to implementing their short-term rental regulations and reviewing them in light of opting into this principal residency requirement. Tofino already had a principal residency requirement in place for short-term rental for quite some time, where you need to have at least one unit that's used for long-term on a property if you're going to have another unit that's used for short-term. And Osoyoos has never, to my understanding, had a real robust framework related to short-term rental. So they've opted in, and they're actually in the midst of updating their short-term rental regulatory framework right now. So it is interesting looking at other resort municipalities who are grappling with similar issues that Revelstoke grapples with. And none of them have really been at it long enough now that we can get a good sense on what this looks like. However, we have talked to some other municipalities. Kelowna is one that was hit quite hard with this principal residency requirement, where they had about 700 condo units that were purpose-built short-term rental that overnight were no longer permitted to be used at. And one of the real interesting things there was the transition rate, seeing how many went back into the long-term rental market. There's been studies that estimate at best you're going to get maybe 20-30% that go from short-term rental to long-term rental with opting into this principal residence requirement. And our understanding in Kelowna is that it was far less than that. So we're starting to see some data come out of this. And I think with the provincial legislation, there's a lot of well intentions behind it, but we're just starting to see the execution and what the tangible impact on the housing market actually is. So I hope that answers that question.
Before I get into the next question, does anyone else have any questions in person? Okay. So why have bed and breakfast business licenses, the fees gone from $50 to $750 per year when bylaw enforcement is primarily used for nightly STR, not bed and breakfast? I was told the change is business license fees was for bylaw enforcement. That's part of all business license fees, but business license fees also go to how we monitor that use as well. So bed and breakfast also do go on an online platform. And so there's other administrative costs that go with bed and breakfast as well. I'm not sure if Paul has anything to add with that.
Only thing I would add is that we understand it's hard. People aren't working day to day with us. Administering the business licensing process and monitoring and tracking people that are doing nightly rentals, whether it's a B&B or short-term rental, is an incredibly resource-intensive process. And the whole intent of this fee increase that was approved by council is to ensure cost recovery so that our department isn't using general taxation dollars to pay for the cost associated with that enforcement and that management of the whole business licensing process.
Next question is, there could also be a combined approach of not necessarily opt-in. However, the city could introduce that themselves and add that into the current model. So that current principal residence owners could then have an opportunity to participate in STR. That's kind of what we're currently doing. And it is definitely a possibility that the city could move towards. We could look at a hybrid model. And if that comes back as something that the community wants, that's something that we would definitely look into further. Does that answer the question?
Just to add on, do the survey.
Yeah.
And I think on question 9, you're probably going to be looking at answer B, if I remember correctly.
Also, the survey is a little feely. It's like more qualitative than quantitative, which isn't typical of our department. So yeah, just fill out that survey.
All right, continuing on to the questions on Slido, unless anybody is brave enough in the room here. Okay, we will proceed with the questions. So this next one is, with this project plan / timeline in place, will current bylaw enforcement of illegal STR rentals be on pause or still in place? Especially with the new provincial STR registry being implemented, will this give bylaw more tools to locate and fine / shut down illegal ones? Well, it works out that I was going to get past that question regardless of who read it. So bylaw enforcement will continue the enforcement of the current regulatory framework. We have not been directed by council to pause that. From the feedback we've gotten from the community when it comes to, from what we've heard so far, that's not what the community would like either. They do want to see us continuing to do this as we're working through this. So at the end of the day, the regulations are still the regulations. So bylaw enforcement will be continuing to do their enforcement, standard enforcement on STRs throughout the entirety of this project, unless directed otherwise by council.
Come on up.
Hi. I was going to read a big old thing, but everybody's kind of feeling the same way, so I don't really need to, but I just want my perspective on things. I've opened 100 childcare spaces in the last 4 years because of my SDRs. Thank you. And I really, really want to open up another 100 in the next 4 to 5 years as well. And by doing that, I'm an entrepreneur. It's a not-for-profit, so it's a for-profit. And so my funding comes from my SDRs. So as an entrepreneur, I help a lot of people in this town. And because of my 2 Mackenzie Village properties, and it's weird to think that there'd be like a blanket, bylaw, I guess, for everybody. And I think Mackenzie Village is a little different, and RMR is a little bit different than when I'm living downtown and across the street there's a beautiful home that is illegally being run as an Airbnb. I think it has to be even and kind of fair, so that I can continue building and helping the economy of this town through childcare. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much for that comment. And I think it brings an important dynamic to this discussion that we touched upon at the beginning. This is a complex issue with a lot of elements to it, and it's not always as simple as ban all short-term rentals or allow them everywhere and let me run my property the way I want. There's always nuance to this. So the next question. In the survey, you ask if we have too many, too few, or the right amount of STRs in community. Do you have any additional benchmarks or context to help people determine this, i.e. percentage of housing required for our workforce, number of jobs in the community, et cetera? Very good question. We are hoping as part of the survey that putting some background data and some statistics, including some of which we've shared with you today, kind of on the front end of that survey, would help paint that picture. And as Adrienne had indicated in part of her presentation, we're at such early stages and we're trying to do a really high level survey right now where it's gauging the temperature of the community on what people's feelings generally are who are living here day in, day out. Do you feel that we have too much STR? Do you feel we have too few? Just generally trying to gauge that temperature and try to move us towards understanding what the general goal of the community is as it relates to short-term rental in Revelstoke. Yeah.
Okay, for the next question, it says you reference B&B not permitted in a secondary suite. Oh, where'd it go? And STR is permitted in a carriage house, is not permitted in a carriage house or garden suite, which seems a bit contradictory. Can you clarify by outlining the definition of those types of suites? So a secondary suite is contained within your single-family dwelling. So that can be beside it, or it can be a basement suite, but it's contained within one building. So you can have an STR within that building, which is connected to your house, where the regulations allow for either full home rental or a permanent resident on-site operator. The bed and breakfast regulation, you would not be able to have that in a suite as it's its own self-contained dwelling unit. So bed and breakfast, they're more of a historic use throughout many municipalities and residential zones, and the intent was to have your bedrooms in the house rented, you have common space within the house, everything's connected, and you have a breakfast in the morning. It's kind of changed over the years, but that regulation has stayed in place within the current bylaw, and we added short-term rentals in. So they are similar-ish, but we do have a FAQ that anyone can grab here that really helps identify the difference of a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental. For the carriage suite and garden suite, those are detached buildings. So that's not being operated within a self-contained dwelling unit in your home. So we never opened it up to having the short-term rental use in a detached building at this stage. So we gradually changed the regulations, and that's something that the community may have comments on this at this time, but currently it's only within a secondary suite or the principal dwelling in one building.
I think it's if the city will make a final decision on the province regulations about opting in, or will it be kept year-to-year basis? So right now, we don't know if we'll be opting in. That will be essentially a final decision of council based on some of the findings that are going to be in the next year from this open collection of data. And from my understanding, you opt in, and once you opt in, you're opting in for the year. So if the city were to choose doing that, we can't just opt in and opt out. It would be, we're opting in and it's for a select term.
So the term of that, just to kind of elaborate a little bit further on that, the term of that is a yearly basis. So it's, I believe, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe you opt in March. And then you have until that following year to re-opt back or to opt out or opt in. It can be done. Unfortunately, the legislation does allow it to be on a year-to-year basis. So it is at the will of council, which at the end of the day is based on whether the community would like it or not. So if you want opting in or not opting in, the feedback for that would be going directly to council.
So wait, I just got to ask, everyone in here didn't go back in time and read the staff report from January 9th, 2024 that outlined all the specific details? No? Okay, so we can give you the specific dates. So opting in, you have to opt in by March 31st each year, which would take effect November 1st of the same year. So it can be done on a yearly basis, so you can see how we could be on this hamster wheel in perpetuity the way the legislation was drafted.
My follow-up on that question is, so if we opt in this year, do we have to actively opt out, or is it default that we're opted out unless we opt in?
You would have to actively opt out. And from staff's perspective, it's not up to us which way we go. Obviously, it's a council decision. And council is going to want to know what the community feels in terms of regulating short-term rentals. And then staff can come forward with saying, here's all the different tools that we can do. And if this community comes out and says, we want to be as restrictive as we possibly can be, we don't care at all about what the consequences are, And staff are going to say, okay, opt into the principal residence requirement, build on top of that some incredibly strict zoning regulations that would restrict this use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we do that, and then the next council comes along and says opt out, then we got to revamp our zoning framework again. And then the next council comes in and says, actually, the next year we want to opt in. We got to revamp the zoning framework again. So from staff's perspective, we would really like to do this once, do it right. And if there's ever going to be future changes or future reviews, really clearly lay out what the parameters of that would be. And maybe we say, you know, if we ever get to a point that short-term rentals exceed X% of our total dwelling stock, then we want to revisit our short-term rental regulations so that we have a healthy balance. So we want to make sure we have some good objective parameters in there to guide us into the future so that we're being smart about this segment of our economy.
I'll probably have follow-ups.
Do you want to come up to the mic? Yeah.
Just following up on Erica's answer a few questions ago, I just have it's personal curiosity, but with regards to SDRs not being in the detached component of a I don't want to say multi-unit, but like where if you would have a carriage home or if you had a garden suite or whatever the case may be, what's the policy rationale for not permitting an SDR in that element of your home? Is that question clear? Okay.
So the question was the rationale for not allowing an STR within a detached dwelling where there is a permanent resident on site in the main dwelling. It's something that staff have gone back and forth with discussing, but when we did do the updates to allow carriage suite and garden suite, it was within the updated zoning bylaw that was not focusing on short-term rental regulations. So when we were doing that phase one housekeeping amendment to now what you're seeing with the proposed new draft zoning bylaw, it was focusing on allowing different housing forms and variations of housing within the community. So allowing not just secondary suites, we also opened up secondary suites in duplexes and triplexes, fourplexes to be able to suite, and then also that detached option. But we didn't want to open up that short-term rental discussion without doing this type of project of where short-term rentals are appropriate. So it was left in the secondary suite as that's contained in the dwelling unit and won't have a greater impact on the neighborhood by having it in a detached dwelling. Whether that's something that the community wants to see a change in, the rationale was to open up housing forms and variations of housing forms for long-term rental.
I guess this is more like a comment or thinking out loud. The bill seems to have a lot of like restrictions and seems to be very complex with like opting in and opting out. I'm just wondering, as a community, do we even need to opt in at any time and instead just pick and choose and decide as a community what regulations we want and just never even think about opting into this thing? Because it seems to come with a lot of restrictions and we as a community could just decide which restrictions we want. So question, comment, take it as you want.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Now we're done this project now, and thank you so much.
She'll have to work
on. Yeah, drafting a bylaw, though, it does take a considerable amount of time. I wish that it was just like, psh, and it would be created, because I would love that zoning bylaw to be done as well. But it's really, we need that temperature check. This is such a hot button topic. It affects every single one of us. We all know someone in our community that either owns and operates a short-term rental or works for one. We all know someone that's benefiting well from one or someone that is having challenges with one. So it's very much a part of our lives. It's something that we really do need to think about. And one of the hardest positions being up at this table is that we don't get to think about the individual. We really, really have to think about the collective. But to think about the collective, we need to hear the voices of the collective in this. Yeah.
Before jumping on the next question here, just wanted to kind of follow up on what Adrian had said there. That is, we've talked about this as staff, and that is something at the end of the day, we're not wanting the opt-in, opt-out to be really the big focus of this conversation. But what you've said as far as looking at creating a made-in-Revelstoke solution that works for the community, that's exactly that end goal of what we'd like to achieve. Obviously, at the end of the day, whether or not we opt in or opt out is truly the discretion of council. Staff would like to give, we won't be giving necessarily that direct recommendation. We'd like to hear what the community has to say. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, you've kind of summed up what we'd like to achieve with this project. Okay, so moving on to the next question on Slido here. We've got, will the city be considering the BC legislation definition of STR as less than 90 days, or will they stand by their current definition of less than 30 days? That's a great question. I asked myself that same question when the legislation came in. Really, what it comes down to is we would like to stick with the 30 days the way it is currently now. The reason being is if you were to change that to 90 days, that eliminates the ability for people to actually rent their homes month to month. Because if they're doing it as month to month, then they would then be in contravention, they would be considered a short-term rental. Now, it is a conversation that's been had with other municipalities as well when this legislation was first announced. A lot of municipalities asked that same question. What are we doing? Why our standard definition is 30 days? Why is the legislation 90? And the province said, don't worry, you can keep it as it is, or you can go with the 90. But from our perspective, we want to look at it as we do not want to be looking at creating challenges for landlords to then be potentially in contravention of a bylaw when they are truly not operating as a short-term rental, but rather offering different options for accommodation, right? So month-to-month rentals are an important part of our rentals. We still do need them. So we do want to make sure we do keep that as an option for the community.
Sorry, I thought we had another.
I'm thinking about it.
Okay, you keep stewing on it. We're ready. You can come on up. Okay, next question on the slide up. How is the city currently benefiting money-wise from short-term rentals? Is it strictly business licenses? 400 STR at 500 is only $200,000. Is it enough? Are there other means considered to collect more tax? So the city does collect business license revenue. We also do collect what's called the MRDT tax associated with short-term rentals. Very critical money that does come into the city. MRDT, a portion of it goes into a fund called the Online Accommodation Platform Fund, otherwise known as OAP funding, that actually goes towards supporting affordable housing projects within the community. And one of the big things in the Development Services Department that we've been focused on for the last couple of years, because what we do is, believe it or not, and we don't fool ourselves, we're actually not a core service as part of a local government. Planning and development is critically important, but local government, our tax structure is set up roads, water, sewer, parks. Basically, Mr. Black over there. We are supposed to operate in our department as cost recovery. People come in, pay permit application fees, business license application fees, and that's supposed to cover all the work that we do within our department. And while it does fluctuate on a year-to-year basis, the last couple of years have been record-setting for this department, and it has been in part led to a major effort, and I give Mr. Kenny Gyps over there a lot of credit for a lot of work he's done on this. Our department is fully operating cost recovery right now, and the fees that we are bringing in from business license revenue do cover the costs of our business license services within the department. Now, that said, what we do doesn't just impact our department, it also impacts our finance department, our engineering department that reviews permits and licenses, et cetera. So there is a broader impact on cost recovery, but in general, we are closer to cost recovery associated with these license and permit applications than we have ever been as a city.
Can you also correct the math? It's not $500 to get a license.
So I can correct that. The correction was it's not $500 to get a license. It's $500 base fee plus $250 per bedroom that you're renting out. So you could have 4 bedrooms that are being rented out, which would be a total license fee of $1,500 annually.
I just have a quick follow-up question. What is the revenue equivalent, like, is the Airbnb short-term rental revenue equivalent to what like a hotel pays, or is it less, or is it, how do they line up? So like, what's the benefit of STRs to the city, to versus, say, a purpose-built hotel?
That is a very good question. And that is definitely something we could follow up with our director of finance on to see if we can, I don't know if we actually get the breakdown that way from the province in terms of the taxation that we collect, where they delineate between traditional tourist accommodation and residential short-term rental. But it's definitely something that if you wanted to follow up with us, we could inquire about that.
So with new information, I have a few questions. I guess it's not really new information too much to me, but you collect taxes on short-term rentals, which you just said. And short-term rental proposed is anything under 90 days. So as a person who has license as a short-term rental but actually lives there, it seems to me that the consequence from my perspective would be in my best interest to advertise a 5-month contract over the winter season to the person who's going to pay the most and sign the agreement that they're leaving after 5 months. Right now, that would probably be some movie stars from California. I could easily charge enough to leave, and that's fine. But right now, I house myself, who works in town, and 2 other people who work in town. So at the minimum, that's 3 beds gone, 3 people gone. At the maximum, it's at least 4 if I can find a way to stay in town to keep my job. So there are, I guess, like, it's more of a comment than a question, but there's a thing called the law of unintended consequences. And that, I think, is a definite unintended consequence. But I can go ski in Golden. I can go work in Lake Louise. I don't have to be in Revelstoke. In fact, Lake Louise has a longer season, so, you know, like, there's other things other than, like, can we put this directly into the long-term housing, which you already said was a very low adoption rate in Kelowna. But I don't know, also the way that development works is you have to get a bunch of pre-sales to even buy the place. So if people are saying, oh, you take a place away, well, no, if it wasn't bought before it was built, it didn't exist anyways. So how did you take away something that doesn't exist? Like, these are just implications and maybe considerations that I think we might be overlooking. So, comment, not a question.
Thank you for that. Anyone else in person that would like to come up to the mic?
Just jumping on the point about hotels as well, if we could get numbers of how many hotel rooms we have in total too, and kind of the regulations around how many more hotels could get built, just at a standpoint that the hotels that are generally being built in Revelstoke are corporate-owned hotels owned by companies outside of Canada. We're watching our revenue leave Revelstoke, whereas short-term rentals are owned by a lot of locals. We also have a lot of Canadian residents as well. It's the majority of our owners, and we're seeing that revenue staying in Revelstoke as well. So getting those figures would be great too.
And we are documenting all the questions, and Ruth here is putting the questions and writing down the answers, and where we need to elaborate a bit more on answers, those will be posted. So we have documented that question. We'll get more of a detailed answer for you guys, and it'll be posted on Talk Revelstoke.
What do you mean, no? So the comment that was made earlier about, do we make a made-in Revelstoke solution, or do we decide to opt in or opt out? I think we summed up rather well, and Kenny made the comment as well in support. I think we just have to look back at Bill C-44 with the province, where they decided that we're going to change 60 years of urban planning and say all houses, single family, can now have 4 dwelling units on it, and tossed out all of the planning that we have done to make Revelstoke what it is. So, perfect example is this province decides that 90 days is the term considered for short-term rental, which clearly makes no sense. So I think it would behoove us as Revelstoke to basically ignore the province, because they haven't got a very good track record and essentially disrupting Revelstoke. Further to that, a short-term rental uses a lot more utilities. To Mr. Black, who is trying to keep our infrastructure up to date, if we use a short-term rental, we're going to run more water, more sewer, more roads. We're going to impact our infrastructure a lot more. So it's not just, do we need housing, do we need short-term rental, but the conversation that's not necessarily being had or talked about is, what does that do to our infrastructure? Because if we're putting that many more people here, which they need to be here, they want to be here, what does that do to our infrastructure? What does that do to our poo plant? What does that do to our water mains, et cetera, et cetera? So it would be nice to see more of that conversation and that cost impact, cost recovery detailed out.
I just need to clarify that point. No, David, just let me, just 2 seconds. We manage 100 vacation rentals in Revelstoke. I work for Revelstoke Vacation Rentals. They sit at about 50% occupancy of the year. They use dramatically less utilities than the average occupied home.
And I'd just like to comment on the contribution, or whatever we're talking about, $500 for a license fee. We've, as a developer, builder of predominantly short-term rentals, we have probably contributed more to DCCs than any other project combined. On top of that, you know, it's not just it's roundabouts, sidewalks, another roundabout, reservoir upgrades, all sorts of things. And then on top of that, you've got to Francis's point, if it's not there for people to buy, then it doesn't get built. So the existing phases alone contribute, I think, over $1 million a year recurring taxes. That's a big number for the city. That's not $500, $250. That's a considerable number. So the contribution is big.
Thank you for that feedback. And again, another example that shows this isn't a simple issue. There's so many different elements to it, right? And I think it also shows, you know, the need to really carefully consider how we move forward. And as we do move forward, completing a robust economic analysis so that this community is going in eyes wide open if we do opt to change any of our current regulations pertaining to short-term rentals.
The next question on the Slido is, would be nice if an owner had the opportunity to SDR their home while they are away on long-term vacation. So currently, under our regulations, 30 days or less is considered short-term. And if you were going away for longer than that, you could rent out your property, you could rent out your dwelling unit, and it would be kind of more considered a long-term. Yeah.
All right, next question, unless we got anybody else. All right. So next question is, how successful is the city being at getting offenders to pay fines? How much have you made in fines, and what are you doing with that money? I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? No. The exact figure on how much we've collected in fines for specifically short-term rentals, I don't have that exact figure here today. The reason being is the way our financial software works, it is a little bit hard to extrapolate because the fines associated with short-term rental aren't just you're operating a short-term rental. It's failure to obtain a business license, failure to display a business license, it is parking issues, it is noise complaints. It is such a broad scope when it comes to short-term rentals, right? It can be many different topics. That said, we are actually doing fairly good at collecting the fines. Overall, we've seen now, I'm trying to remember, I've got it written in the report that's going to committee of the whole here next in March. That does give the full stats relating to our bylaw enforcement, but it's about 54% of our fines are recovered. That is actually higher, surprisingly, that is a higher recovery rate than a lot of municipalities. That said, if somebody doesn't pay their fine, it gets sent to collections, and then you get hounded by collections. Alternatively, with some of these higher short-term rental enforcement files, ones that are these repeat offenders where we work on it, I'll give you a brief example. We had a situation where there was a legal operated short-term rental. We issued them $2,000 in initial municipal tickets for fines over the course of a period of time. They still refused to come into compliance, so we filed a long-form information. What that is that is a larger offense notice that is then filed and registered with the court system. They are then called into court. They are then having to defend themselves in court for whether or not they've committed those offenses. Those fines can range anywhere from minimums in our bylaw right now, I believe, for the zoning bylaw are set at $3,000 with a maximum of $50,000 per offense. So every day you commit an offense, it is a new offense. That said, we don't always have to levy the maximums. We don't have, depending on the situations, we can levy a little bit under the minimum. In this circumstance, the individual paid, what was it? $11,000 in fines associated with the long form, and then $2,000 in fines associated with the municipal ticket information, as well as the cost of our legal and our enforcement. So all said and done, I believe that individual paid close to about $19,000 in overall expenses. That's one instance. We have another situation where we have another repeat offender. It's an investigation that's gone on. Unfortunately, these investigations do take some time when somebody doesn't want to come into compliance. We have a total of $8,000 in fines going for a payment hearing, which is another means we can use to collect the fines if somebody refuses to pay. We can file a different type of notice with the court system, which is called a payment hearing. Again, they get called to court. If they fail to show up to court, a bench warrant will be issued for their arrest. They'll get hauled in by the police, likely released on a promise to appear, and then they have to show up for the next court hearing. With that one, we have $8,000 going next week. We have one payment hearing for $8,000. That individual also has an additional $10,000 in fines that are outstanding on top of that were levied afterwards, and we'll be filing for a payment hearing for that as well. So we do have means to collect it, but roughly we're looking for 2024. Advertising without a business license, there was 13 offenses. Carry on without a valid license was 6. Failure to display a business license was 23. Failure to notify of change was 2. Failure to obtain a business license was 6. And then use contrary to zoning bylaw was 15. So a total of 65 tickets. Those tickets range typically around the $500 per offense range, which is the maximum we can issue under our bylaw offense notice bylaw.
Kind of a follow-up to that. Do we have stats on if the offenders are local residents versus outside investors?
Great question. I don't have the specific stats regarding those of the offenders for specifically short-term rental, but we do have that in the report that's going to the committee of the whole there March 11th, I believe it is, with the full breakdown of the number of local residents versus BC residents versus American residents. So we do break it down. We did try to collect all of that data so that way we can present that to the community. I don't have that exact one on me, but it is predominantly, we are seeing it as BC residents, not necessarily just Revelstoke, but BC as a whole.
Cool. I'm not too familiar with how law works in terms of like municipal taxes, but could we add those fines to their property taxes for local residents?
That was actually a question that council asked of us as well. Unfortunately, no. The legislation does not allow us to levy that as a part of the municipal taxes. It is something that we have to collect through alternative means. Would I love for us to be able to do it? Absolutely. That would make collection of these fines a little bit easier, but the legislation and the community charge does not allow us to do that where we're taking a municipal ticket or a bylaw offense notice and levy that directly against their property taxes. But that's where we have those situations like the payment hearings, and then we do work with a credit collection agency as well.
Thanks.
One thing too to add on, just to commend your guys' local council. This council had adopted, and I know sometimes people, I think we get 6 or 7 people that tune into the council meetings on average. They are critically important. Everyone should be listening in on them. This council did adopt a bylaw offense notice, what's the wording, Kenny? Bylaw offense notice, ticket bylaw?
Bylaw offense notice bylaw. So as confusing as it is, it's the bond bylaw, so it's the bylaw offense notice bylaw.
And the key thing there is before we had that bylaw in effect, we were only able to ticket locally. Now we're able to ticket people that not only just live outside of Revelstoke, but live outside of the province. So again, the current council should be commended for adopting that bylaw so that we can actually start getting more tools in our tool belt for this.
On that note, real quick, there was, thanks to the ability to mail those tickets, we actually did successfully resolve an enforcement matter related to an individual who lived in New York. So that was a fun one to try to negotiate with them, but they did pay their fines and they did come into compliance. So this is where having those additional tools really do help.
I'm Caroline from the Revelstoke Chamber of Commerce. I just want to mention a few things. I think it's important for the public to know that The city's economic development department has a great data center called Choose Revelstoke. Tourism Revelstoke also has phenomenal statistics on accommodations. I believe they have some of them on their Destination Revelstoke website. They're a fantastic resource for the public to take a look at. My question would be for the next steps in your economic study, what are you planning on looking at? So right now you're getting feedback from the public on what it is that we would like to see, and then different stakeholder groups, but what list of bullet points are you going to be hitting for that? What are you looking for?
For the economic study, and maybe even just to back up a second, to kind of walk you guys through the sequencing of events of how this project is structured. Community comes out, tells us what their aspirations, their goals are for this project. We go to council, council solidifies that, gives us an idea of here's the overall goal we're trying to achieve. Staff then come up with a few different scenarios. Here's how we can achieve that goal with the community, that the community has identified, that council's endorsed. We then use those scenarios in an economic analysis to look at things like direct impacts on municipal and MRDT revenues, estimated change in revenue for short-term rental and non-short-term rental properties, estimated change in tourist spending based on total change in visitors, estimated local employment impacts from the spending changes outlined previously, indirect economic impacts arising from direct spending changes from tourists that are coming into town or therefore not coming into town if we are being overly restrictive with short-term rentals, induced economic impacts which are caused by changes in household spending associated with change in the labor income that's estimated based on the local economic impact if, again, we went overly restrictive on short-term rentals and then all of a sudden we have all these businesses that are struggling. So there's a lot of items that we would be looking to unpack as part of that economic analysis for different scenarios, come back out to the community, provide that objective information so that everyone's walking in eyes wide open as to what is ultimately on the table. And then council, again, with feedback from the community, will have the final say as staff draft bylaws to figure out which scenario we want to go with. Does that answer the question?
So next question. If you don't opt in to the provincial regulations, can you still access the regulatory or enforcement tools that the province is developing? Yes, that is available to all municipalities in BC. I'm not sure if Kenny wants to elaborate on that as he is administering the enforcement program, but those are available to us.
Yeah, so we do have access, and we have thankfully had access to the provincial registry from when it was initially launched. So there are some changes coming to that system, but we do have access. One of the nice things with Bill 35 is that it gave us everything under the legislation except for the the primary residence requirement. That is the only piece of that legislation that is that opt-in, opt-out piece. So we do have access to the lovely provincial portal, which gives us very good data. And that is honestly where a lot of our enforcement files have been initiated from. It allows us the ability to use the takedown notice, the notice of non-compliance, as well as the takedown requirement on all of the larger platforms. So the simple answer is yes, we do have access to those, and they are very helpful.
And one thing just to add on to that, we'll throw a plug out there for the province of BC. Anyone who is operating a short-term rental, I believe the final date is May 1st that you need to sign up on the provincial platform with your business license number to make sure that you don't get delisted. So for anyone who's operating any type of short-term rental accommodation, make sure you do go onto the province of BC's platform, register on there, pay your annual fee, and you won't have any issues.
The next question. I just noticed the Benchlands RMR housing project is being marketed as STR. Just wanted to point out to people to say that there is even more STR style housing being added to the supply. Curious about all the townhomes proposed behind Mackenzie Village, of those will be STR. So I think when opening in this presentation, we talked about the projected numbers that can happen. We aren't to full build out right now. So RMR does have numerous amounts of beds that they are able to operate as STRs if they would like to, as well as Mackenzie Village within their zoning, which is currently CD20. It is a permitted use within that zoning. Paul, maybe you might want to take this further.
Yeah, just to clarify, in case there's any real planning nerds out there that love this stuff as much as we do, the Mackenzie Village current zoning is CD17, and then RMR, Revelstoke Mountain Resort zoning is CD08. If anyone's curious to go and unpack the development entitlements that are currently approved within those zones. And I believe what's being referred to here when they talk about the townhomes behind Mackenzie Village, I think it might be referring to the Stoked Living development, which, as Adrian has indicated, is zone CD20, and short-term rental is not permitted. So that's the development that's on the east side of Hay Road. That's more of a comprehensively planned community with, off the top of my head, somewhere between 70 and 75 units total that are going to go in there, mix of single-family, duplexes, and row homes. But again, just to clarify, the Stoked Living development off on the east side of Hay Road, not permitted short-term rental. They're not even permitted bed and breakfast under their current zoning. Mackenzie Village, CD17, they have short-term rental entitlements within that zone.
Okay, so it looks like the top two questions on Slido. Oh, we got somebody coming on up.
Hi. So just a couple of sort of questions, comments. The existing short-term rental zoning seems perplexing. We have properties with that don't have short-term rentals or the zoning, but next-door neighbors do. Across the street does, so it's a bit confusing to say the least. I certainly understand and appreciate how, the hotel industry, the resort, would like to, make available more accommodation for their workforce. And that totally makes sense, but, completely restricting short-term rental may not make sense as well. People are doing it illegally anyway. And I guess the other comment would be, carrot versus stick. If, you're really trying to incentivize long-term rental and not disincentivize short-term rental, maybe actually think about that side of the equation. What could you do to actually incentivize people to do long-term rental? I know there's a lot of challenges with provincial rules and regulations around that, but at the moment, there's definitely homeowners in my neighborhood where you've got, 2,000 to 3,000 square foot houses with probably, one resident in there. And they could easily, convert some of that space to long-term rental or short-term rental for that matter. But frankly, the incentives probably aren't really there. So I think maybe building or adding on to this project would be, how do you actually incentivize long-term rental? Because as you say in Kelowna, if people just close down their short-term rentals and don't do anything else with it, that doesn't really help the overall problem with housing in the city in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, you, again, that kind of hit the whole project, that kind of sums it up, right? So right now, our current spot zoning, that is part of the challenge associated with that is part of the challenge associated with our current regulatory framework. That is part of the reason as well why council passed that policy DS23 back in 2022, that essentially directed staff stop supporting applications for spot zones. We want to see, if we're bringing forward any rezonings or people apply for rezonings, we want it to be in specifically designated areas where it actually works. But the spot zones, council don't want to see those, didn't want us to bring forward those spot zones while we were looking at the scope of the scope of STRs, and that was kind of why it was that period of waiting and holding. So part of this project will be examining the pockets of properties all over the city. Is that working or is it not? Right? That's again part of this whole project and the feedback that we welcome from everybody here and online and the rest of the community. Is that what you'd like to see? Do you want to see it sprinkled into neighborhoods and kind of this ad hoc where as property owners would like, or do you want to see it condensed into certain areas, right? Is it Is it suited to be in resort fringe areas, areas bordering the resort? Or do you want to kind of have that flexibility of it anywhere in the community, or again, specific zones? So, thank you.
And if I may, I actually would play a little bit of devil's advocate to the premise of that question, if I may respectfully. Should it be on individual homeowners within this town, number one, to be supplying long-term rental accommodation to people who desperately need a place to live? And I think we're living through that experiment right now, and I would argue the incentive is people are renting out one-bedroom suites for $1,500 or two-bedroom suites for $1,200 or $1,500 a bedroom. So there's definitely a financial incentive. The Residential Tenancy Act rules can be challenging for landlords, most certainly, but should we be doing that? And we're also seeing landlords that may be putting 10 people living in one house where these individuals are then underhoused. So from the planning department's perspective, we should be focused on building dense purpose-built rental housing to satisfy the rental needs within this community where there is safe, secure, appropriate housing for individuals so that they aren't underhoused with so many people living in one dwelling unit. And we are really happy to say, and we'll see how much of it actually comes to fruition, but we got over 600 units of non-market rental or purpose-built rental that would be on the market side housing that is in the hopper right now. When we say in the hopper, means an approved development permit or a development permit that's under review, a building permit that is approved and issued, but maybe construction hasn't started, or construction's underway. So we have a lot of stuff that is happening within the community right now, and we are confident that some of the rental challenges we're seeing in the community, it can't come fast enough, but over the next 2 to 5 years, as a lot of these projects start to come online, keep in mind, it takes at least 24 months usually to build a big apartment building. The stuff doesn't happen fast. It is complex. We are confident that some of these rental challenges will be alleviated, and hopefully, if we have enough of it on the market, you start to see prices come down. So just, again, food for thought. But with that, one of the questions in here on Slido next is how many short-term rentals are operating with a license and how many are operating without a license? So we have about 240 licenses issued right now for short-term rental or bed and breakfast. And the last numbers we checked, I think we're around 140 properties where we would classify it as their compliance status is unknown. So it might just be a matter of them being zoned appropriately and they don't have a license and they need a license. Or it could be a matter of them not being zoned for short-term rental and therefore their operation needs to be shut down or they need to try and go through a rezoning process. So we're at about 140 right now, again, where their compliance status is currently unknown, but it is under active investigation from our bylaw enforcement group, utilizing both see-click-fix for reacting to complaints that come in, as well as proactive enforcement measures through the provincial platform, which is free for us, where we were paying 15 grand a year before for prior software. So we do appreciate that from the province. It's one really good thing from the new legislation.
So we have lost most of the affordable accommodations, hostels. Increasing the supply of SDRs may offset this loss and create an opportunity for those who want to come to town but can't afford to stay in high-end SDRs hotels. They've recommended the option to diversify options and the economy. So it sounds like they'd like to add more SDRs to not have so many high-end SDRs. Looks like it's a comment. Maybe I'll go down to the next one. If another comment, Revelstoke problems are best solved by Revelstoke solutions. So this is part of the project, is understanding what works best for Revelstoke. So this is just starting that off and hearing from everybody, and we will have more options and opportunities to actually figure out what the best Revelstoke solution is. That's what the next question. How do you study the economic impacts of not having enough long-term places because of short-term places? So with this, we have housing needs assessments, and we've had many projects come through that inform the official community plan, our zoning bylaw, where we're lacking in different forms of housing. We have stats on single-family homes, duplexes, the need of multi-unit dwellings. So we have been going full speed ahead with multi-unit housing. We have projects for multi-unit housing below market. The question disappeared. What was it?
The question was, how do you understand the economic impacts associated with long-term or with short-term accommodation taking up long-term accommodation? And I think one of the challenges with that, if I may, is it's assuming that short-term rental is causing a shortage of long-term rental, which there's a lot of economic studies out there. Some of them say, yeah, there's some impact. Some of them say, yeah, there's not as much of an impact. And I think what's important is when we pull up the stats that we had, we have Mackenzie Village that is a comprehensive development zone that is intended for purpose-built short-term rental, and then the resort. And when you take those out, only 5% of dwelling units in the city are even eligible to be used as short-term rental. So trying to unpack the magnitude of the impact it's having on long-term rental, it might not be as great as it may appear on the surface.
We're talking a lot about business and economics, but nobody's been talking about quality of life. So I'm a long-term resident, but I'm also a landlord. I've been a short-term landlord, a legal one, and I quit doing that about 10 years ago, and I'm happy to be a long-term landlord. When you're surrounded by short-term rentals, it changes the neighborhood. It changes your surroundings, your neighbors. It's not pleasant. I support the idea of short-term rentals being in the commercial area and the fringe commercial and in the development zones that we have set up for that. When people are moving there, they know what they're getting, as opposed to in an area that's single-family dwellings and suddenly you're surrounded by businesses, because they are businesses. And we're not really talking about the hotels in town. And we're talking about how short-term rentals employ people, and they do, but so do hotels. And if we have more hotels, there's more jobs. So I'd like to see the zoning stay the way you've got it laid out. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I was like, that's kind of a compliment to us, so thank you. Our zoning is quite complex when it comes to this, though. Next question is there a consideration for a head tax per occupants of the STRs to draw more tax money for our city? This is commonplace in other resort communities around the world. Honestly, Paul, do you mind just taking this head tax?
We can't implement taxes that way in British Columbia. So what the city does, we set what's called the mill rate. BC assessment sets the tax classification and your assessed value. Take your assessed value, multiply it by the mill rate, gives you your taxes, generally speaking. And I'm sure our director of finance would be saying I'm butchering it, but in general, the city sets the rate. We can't determine your classification. So what's proposed in there, although an interesting and potentially innovative idea, the province would need to drastically change the way that we collect taxes in British Columbia in order to actually achieve that as a local government.
Thanks, Paul. Next question. Would outstanding fines on an STR restrict their ability to renew a business license? Yes. If we're doing our business license renew and we're looking at an applicant and we find in our research that there's outstanding fines, then we can't really renew it, and or it gets added into the fees that they're currently outstanding. And essentially they get, if you don't pay for your business license, there's an accumulation that goes onto your outstanding fees for your non-paid business license. So you will actually be incurring, it's not necessarily a fine, but your rate for your business license will continue to go up. Is RMR land impacted by any decision, or are they exempt? Currently, RMR is zoned CDE 8. And they do have specific regulations that are found within our zoning bylaw for them to be able to operate their short-term rentals. So I'm just going to read right from this handout that you can get up at the front if you'd like. The use of a dwelling unit for temporary commercial tourist accommodation, whether by means of a rental pool or not, is permitted anywhere in this zone. There is no requirement for a permanent resident on-site operator, and whole home rentals are permitted in all residential developments.
If I just may add on to that, I think that the question is getting at, if the city ever decided to opt into the principal residence requirement, would it impact the resort lands? And the resort lands would be exempt from the principal residence requirement, but the rest of town would still be subjected to it again, which would impact multiple zones that are permitted short-term rental right now.
And on that topic, it is actually written into the legislation that the resort lands as governed are within that resort designated area are exempted from that legislation. You can actually see the map, the layout of the map for the resort designated areas within the provincial website. So before I move on to the next slide question, I just want to do a quick time check for it. We're coming up to about 7:40 right now. We're kind of slated to go until about 8 o'clock. We don't mind going a little bit over, but obviously it is a Wednesday night. We don't want to keep everybody here till, midnight. So if there is anybody in the room who'd like to come up and talk, I'd encourage you to do it now. Keeping in mind that any of the questions that are entered into the Slido, we will be preparing responses for them, and then we'll post those out to Talk Revelstoke. So don't feel as though if it's on Slido, they won't get answered. It will. I just want to make sure that everybody in the room has had an opportunity to, if they do want to come up to the mic and speak, they have that chance. So open it up. No takers. Okay. So the next one is, it's hard to understand why so much money is being spent on this review when it appears everything is working well currently. Staff resources and tax dollars are being spent on something that is not broken. So with that, when we did the last session, we did the last public open house, what we heard was people felt that it wasn't working, that they wanted to have more say in what's happening in the community. This is one of those topics, and that's why we put it into the rules of engagement in the beginning. It is one of those topics that is very divisional. Part of the community is going to feel that we should eliminate short-term rentals. Some of them feel that we should add more, open it up to everybody. Others will say, keep it at the current regulatory framework. Again, this is the whole point of this project is based on the direction from public feedback as well as council to say, this is something that we need to look at. Our current process may not be working. It may not be what the community would like. So that's why we're here today.
One thing to just add on to that, obviously it's public information. The budget for this project is $70,000, but I give our finance department and our director of finance a lot of credit for how they get us to budget for these projects. That includes staff time. So it's not coming out of our operational budget. So for myself, I would be coding some of my time specifically to this project so that we're getting that full cost. Even the cost of hosting this event today would be part of that $70,000. So it's not just the cost of doing an economic study, it's the totality of the cost associated with this project. So definitely not a small number, but just to make sure everyone has the context of everything that ultimately goes into those costs. So one of the questions on here next on Slido is, are there any restrictions for someone that wants to do a home exchange for greater than 30 days? So as Adrian had indicated, basically if you're doing anything for more than 30 days with an individual, or it could be a family, then it would be considered long-term. But one of the things we always ask ourselves in the planning department, when someone comes in and says, oh, I'm going away for 2 weeks and I'm doing a home exchange with someone in Tofino and it's going to be amazing. Is this a short-term rental? And now all of a sudden I need to get a license and I'm not zoned for it. We're quite reasonable. And a lot of it comes down to, what is the intent that you're looking to do? And so short-term rental, there has to be intent behind it. If you're looking at operating a short-term rental consistently, then there's intent for that use. If this is a one-off that you're doing once every 3 years, yeah, generally speaking, it wouldn't be something that is an issue, but we also need to tread carefully on that so that people aren't taking advantage of that as a loophole. So we do encourage anyone who's looking at doing anything of that nature, come in, chat with development services. It's kind of case by case, but generally speaking, again, if it's 2 weeks every 3 years, you're doing a home exchange with someone, yeah, that's not showing intent to operate a short-term rental.
I think we answered this question. If we opted in, what impact would it have on RMR and their development plans? So they would be exempt. So no impact on, oh. Oh, Yeah, I would ask if they're here to comment on that, as that's their operation and if it's feasible for them. We can comment on their regulations for land use, and that's what our expertise are in for what they're permitted. But with market logistics, that's something that, if that was to happen, that they'd be providing comment on that. It might be part of our economic analysis that we do with how it impacts different stakeholders, but we would not be doing that on behalf of an individual company. Another question, what metrics and/or, what's that? Oh, key performance indicators, getting some acronyms here. Is your department using to guide strategic decision-making? That is a good question. Paul, do you have an answer to that?
So it is, I'm trying to unpack this as it relates to short-term rentals. Obviously, we do look at collecting data. We've presented several relevant statistics today. So obviously, the number of business licenses that are issued, the number of complaints that are coming in, the fines that are issued, the type of fines, the quantity of money that we receive for those fines, business license revenue, MRDT revenue that comes in as a result of short-term rentals. And then unpacking that a step further would be done through the economic analysis, which I appreciate the question from Caroline at the Chamber, so that we could give you some details into what that economic analysis would unpack. So that would really be those kind of key metrics that we're looking at to guide decision-making associated with short-term rental. But anyone that's interested in general decision-making as it relates to land use and planning and development, every single year, this community did a great job showing up for our official community plan in 2022. And we do an implementation report with data collected and statistics every single year, usually in December or January, that we present to council. So a lot of really good stuff to unpack in there, looking at number of housing units created, what type of housing units are created. So a whole whack of information, engineering related data. So we definitely collect a lot of data at the city to help guide decision making.
Oh, it just switched. Okay. Do you know the ratio of local owners to owners who live outside of Revelstoke operating STRs? If so, do you project that opting in would create more or less revenue staying in Revelstoke? Well, on your business license applications, we do have in general, like based on your title, where you're living. We have a range of operators that live all around the world, United States, some from Europe, a lot in Canada, many in British Columbia, many from Revelstoke. I don't know if we formally track that at this time, or if that's a stat that maybe we will collect. It's a little bit time heavy. We currently use a lot of Excel spreadsheets to collect our data, but we will be moving to new software in 2025, so maybe this is something that we can track a little bit easier. Revenue in Revelstoke. As we've been speaking about tonight over this session, a lot of the revenue stays in Revelstoke, is part of Revelstoke. A lot of us all, not myself, but a lot of other people work and/or own or operate in STR. So a lot of that revenue does stay in Revelstoke. A lot of our restaurants, a lot of kind of the services that we have here, if we didn't have people coming to visit Revelstoke, maybe these restaurants or these services actually wouldn't be able to continue to operate. So it is a really layered thing that isn't just about being able to operate an SDR or not. It's what would happen to our economy if we just said no, or if we just fully opened it. Things to think about.
All right, so next one on here is revisiting the ability for a homeowner to rent their house while leaving for vacation. The Tenancy Act has a 4-month notice period for any tenancy. There are no defined term tenancies outside of STR. If you rent your house, the people can legally stay 4 months with free month at the end.
Can I answer that? I'm a licensed property manager and a managing broker. That's not true. Anybody can set, you could write a lease for someone for a week and it's legal. And provided that you're the owner of the property and you're coming back to occupy it for a period of no less than 1 year, that is simply not true. So this person, call Revelstoke Property Services, I'll fill you in on the rules. They're all available online. That is absolutely not true.
Thank you for that one. I appreciate the help on that one. So, on that, yes, right? Like there is the tenancy laws that regulate it. There has been cases that we've seen, they've been in the media across North America when it comes to people staying longer in short-term rentals. At the end of the day, our regulatory framework is not the only regulatory framework out there. There is tenancy laws. We have the lovely ability to write leases. There is a lot of different layers to that. So our regulatory framework, again, it's just one piece of that puzzle when it comes to operating short-term rentals. So, yeah. The next one was already answered. I think the next two actually were already answered. So before I'll jump on to the next one here. Are all STRs paying the same business license fee? If so, City of Revelstoke gets greater than $600,000 yearly, which would have a huge loss in working revenue from their budget. Does council foresee a deficit if STRs were to be outlawed? So on that, I wouldn't say directly related to, so yes, STRs do pay based on their base fee as well as the number of bedrooms. That is the same for short-term rentals. As far as our revenue, our yearly revenue for short-term rentals, as it equates across the board. So that again, is one of those hard ones for us to just, I don't have the exact stat on the exact amount related to, because again, that would be looking at the business license revenue. That would be looking at the ticketing revenue as well associated with that. I don't believe we're sitting at the 600, but we could be. That said, again, that's all part of that economic impact assessment, right? Like we are going to be looking at what the economic impact would be if we were to eliminate it fully. But to give you an idea, our business license annual revenue is well under $600,000 annually. So would it necessarily be a deficit? Again, I'm not the financial director, so I don't want to speak to whether or not we'd be seeing that. But as Paul alluded to earlier, our department does look at operating on a cost recovery basis. So we would be having to look at assessing our department on what needs we would have, as well as, again, that's not the only revenue that the development services department that does regulate business licensing as well. That's not the only revenue that our department does bring in. So we would have to look at how that is offset. But great question.
And I mean, with the stats that we've given you guys tonight, about 234 licenses, STR, B&B, $750 to $1,500 per license. You can do the math. You're probably somewhere in the vicinity of like $170,000 to $200,000 for those licenses alone. So next question. It would be helpful for locals living on site with a secondary suite if there could be fairness, re short-term rental restrictive zones. Seems like short-term rental income is going to non-residents. Have you considered a lottery system to allow a small percentage of locals outside of STR zones to have a short-term rental for a select period of time? So back in November 2021, when we were working on the short-term rental regulations, can't believe that's already over 3 years ago now. The original proposal was to allow short-term rentals in all residential zones with a principal resident on-site operator. So you would live in the suite and rent out above, or live above and then rent out the suite. That was ultimately kicked back to staff after we went through a public hearing process. And what option we ultimately came up with was kind of a pared back version where we allowed that in a very select area, 59 properties that Erica had shown you in our presentation, that have a principal residence requirement adjacent to Hay Road, kind of between Mackenzie Village and the resort. Is that a route we could go? Most certainly. Is there a potential unintended consequence of reducing the amount of long-term rental accommodation in this community? Absolutely. I would also ask the question, is that a big difference? If someone can operate a bed and breakfast right now, but they can't operate a short-term rental. What's the difference between the two? You can't operate a B&B out of a secondary suite. If you do that, then we consider it to be a short-term rental. And an unintended consequence that we're seeing of that, although not at a large scale, but we have had individuals that are peeling out their secondary suites so that they can operate a bed and breakfast. So these are all the items that we got to kind of grapple with associated with this project. And the most important thing, I think, is to be really cognizant of those unintended consequences. And we've done research with a bunch of other resort municipalities now, and no matter what option you go with, there's always going to be unintended consequences. So it's just about trying to be proactive in how you manage those. Quick time check. We're at 7:54, going to be 55 any minute. So we got about 5-6 minutes left. We will answer as many questions as we can, but as indicated, we will provide responses to all the questions that were provided via Slido and put them on the Talk Revelstoke website.
I think you answered a bit of the next question. The market share of STR zone property is dominated by large developers who profit massively from the feature of their housing being rentable as STRs. Why not allow an equal opportunity for single-family homeowners outside these large developments to benefit from STRs as well, a 1-to-1 ratio? So these are all part of the questions. Definitely go to the questionnaire or the survey. You'll get an idea of where you fit in that survey of what you want to see for short-term rentals. So this one is a question that has not been answered with this project at this time. Whether or not we come down hard on short-term rentals, open them up, or keep them as is. But that is a question that we have asked on the survey. So you can go ahead and answer that as a community.
Next question is, would bylaw changes to restrict STR affect the OCP? And would there be a need for amendments and/or additional public engagement? Bylaw changes changing the STR wouldn't necessarily affect the OCP as it is right now. It's more a zoning bylaw thing or consideration to take into. But when we do our next phase of updating the OCP, it was done in 2022. That might be something that the community identifies as a concern or something to be brought into the OCP at that time. But yeah, STR specifically is aligned more so with the zoning bylaw.
And just really quickly on the note of the OCP, there's a clause in section 4 of the OCP under the heading of protecting existing rentals that relates to rezoning applications. So we won't support any rezoning application for new short-term rentals unless in alignment with city bylaws and policies. And essentially, for new short-term rental rezoning applications under the current framework, the only area that would be supported is in the Thomas Brook community that has what we call the resort fringe land use, where the OCP says we can support small-scale, complementary tourist accommodation style operations to the resort there.
I had asked a question. I felt it was pretty important, and it never got addressed, so I'm bringing it up here. There's about 250 licensed vacation rentals. We have this registry, which has, there's an incentive to get it done before the end of the week. It's really going live starting May 1st. It will make it impossible for people illegally vacation renting their units to put it on a platform to do so. And we won't really see the net benefit of that for over a year because a lot of people who are doing it illegally capitalize on the winter. So does that affect your timeline? Is it premature to try to make decisions before we've really felt the effects of what these provincial regulations are intended to do?
Great point. Yeah, you know what? It's the implementation of the registry is definitely going to be an interesting one. At the end of the day, the thing I have found from my years of experience of doing this is if people want to do something, they're going to try to find a way to do it, whether they're legally allowed to or whether they're not. So the registry is going to be one of those pieces that, yes, it will make it more difficult. To be 100% transparent, one of the biggest challenges the province, the way that the province is running their portal system and everything like that is they haven't given us access or requirements for it on every single type of rental platform. Right now, they've restricted it to the big ones, the main ones, the Airbnbs, the bookings.com, the VRBOs. That's part of the challenge, right? So it is going to be, we won't necessarily see the overall impact on what it would be for, like you said, a period of time there. But we will see an initial bit where there will likely be that switch of those people who don't want to are operating illegally, going to those alternative means for getting those bookings. The other piece of it is we do see people who are, they put up their posting and then they book all of get all their bookings for, months on end in one little short period where it's online. So it's tough. It's not necessarily something I don't believe. I mean, Paul, you can weigh in if you'd like, but I don't believe it's going to have any real effect at this point with our timeline. It is something we are considering as, potential to have, again, one of those additional resources that we can use to help draft these regulations. But at this point, the timelines, we're hoping to try to keep on the existing proposed timeline.
I could give you a list of 30 things that could potentially impact our timeline. I'd hope that wouldn't be something that would, but this is kind of the world we're living in right now. And, again, good intent behind a lot of the provincial legislation that's been passed. And for those of you that are kind of out of the loop on it, encourage you to look on the province of BC's website. The fundamental changes to planning and development legislation that we're seeing over the last 2 years now are the most drastic changes we've seen over probably 5-6 decades now. And our group is trying really hard to play catch up with a lot of this. There's so many new tools out there for us, and we got to think about how do we implement them? Do we have the capacity to administer them effectively to achieve their desired intent? And there's a lot of these items that are in flux right now, and it's new. And when we think we have something down, there's a court case, legal precedent gets set, and all of a sudden we need to divert and make a right turn. So we hope it wouldn't affect our timelines, but I wouldn't put it out of the question, most certainly. We are at 8 o'clock. That was a very fast 2 hours. That was exhilarating, talking zoning regulations, provincial legislation, everything to do planning and development. So I hope you guys are as amped up as I am right now, because I'm not going to be able to sleep until about midnight tonight now, maybe even more. Now, we really do appreciate everyone coming out. I give a lot of kudos to our amazing team at the city and in development services here, as well as all city departments. Huge appreciation for our IT group to be able to pull off these events without a hitch, maybe a tiny little hitch with the Slido, but that's not our fault, that's Slido's fault. No, I'm just kidding. Slido is a great feature. It was not defamatory in any way. So excellent, excellent turnout. We really appreciate you guys coming out. Before you leave, please raid the snack table over there. And if you haven't already, do the survey, sign up for Talk Revelstoke, sign up for the community newsletter, be part of this process, follow along, and make sure you give us your feedback. So thank you for coming.
And the donuts are Timbits, to that wonderful question. What flavor are the donuts at the open house? They're Timbits, and they range from chocolate to sprinkled. Enjoy.